Within an environment that is much different to that of their natal homes, it is no wonder that many second-generation immigrants struggle in American society to uncover what defines their true cultural identity. Throughout her short story, Her Mother's House, Ana Menéndez introduces her audience to the conflicting societal pressures that make such a journey so difficult, as well as the familial influences that aid in the understanding of one's cultural significance. Born to Cuban exiles, Menéndez projects her own personal experiences through Lizette, who returns to Cuba to see her exiled mother's childhood home. While the author nor Lizette were born in Cuba, Menéndez reveals the profound connection that many second-generation immigrants have with their natal homes, transcending their current societal and geographical attachments. Lizette, a young reporter from Miami, was traveling under the guise of a simple work trip to Cuba. In reality, Lizette was a second-generation Cuban immigrant whose family was exiled during the Revolution, leading Lizette to struggle in uncovering her own sense of cultural identity. The discontent caused by the struggle eventually led to a termination in her marriage, as she could not develop feelings for her husband, Herminio. In taking this reporting trip, Lizette is hoping to find her mother's childhood home that her mother often described in a whimsical fashion. However, Lizette comes to find that Cuba is nothing like her parents had described, realizing only Miami still cared about the revolution and political turmoil that ensued. Coming upon the house, Lizette is recognized by the familiar shape of her face and is brought to a home that looks nothing like her mother's. After returning to America, Lizette tells her mother that the house looked exactly as she described before forgetting much of the trip many years later. In the end, Lizette reminisces about Herminio in a similar fashion to her mother and her house, symbolizing the fluidity of memory and the effects of nostalgia. Lizette's relationship with Herminio was incredibly complex, as Lizette wanted to love him but could not force herself to. Menéndez mentions that Herminio's family originated from a town near Lizette's mother's, mirroring the way in which Lizette's parents met, in line at the Freedom Tower. While these cultural similarities are what brought Lizette and Herminio together, Lizette did not have a proper understanding of how her culture shaped her being, undeniably creating strain within their relationship. Menéndez describes Herminio's hold of Lizette's waist, as if he worried she was a wisp of smoke, a thin memory of herself, indicating this obvious discontent with her relationship as well as her unfamiliarity with Cuban culture. A thin memory of herself, Lizette's only understanding of Cuba was through the previous experiences of her parents, whom of which had fled the country in fear. Even so, her mother was often nostalgic for the past, despite the traumatic circumstances, and would describe the house like a fairy tale. Comparably, her heart would turn at the lingering smell of her detached husband, despite this detachment being the product of her own isolation. Before Menéndez reveals Lizette's jealousy at the attention her ex-husband receives from other women. In the end, Lizette tells Herminio to leave her alone after he attempts to reconnect with her, similarly to her mother's discouragement of her trip to Cuba, reflecting the complexity of memory and their effects on the now. Although Lizette was unhappy while she was with Herminio and does not want to be with him again, she finds herself reminiscing of him in a similar fashion to her mother's house, providing context as to why an individual may feel nostalgic. Menéndez demonstrates the misconceptions generated by nostalgia when Lizette realizes her mother's interpretation of the home was biased. Even more so, Menéndez adds historical context that reinforces audience comprehension to the geopolitical tension of Central and South America, as well as their effects on immigration. Lizette confesses that she thought Batista Castro was one man, the all-powerful tyrant of the Caribbean, exposing the deep cultural and political repercussions that imperialistic rule has on a previously sovereign nation. Although the Cuban Revolution drove out the wealthier, land-owning individuals, Menéndez exposes the positive influences to have come from this transformation, such as the house's caretakers being given ownership. While Matun is grateful for her family's kindness while he was working, it is evident that their living conditions were less than ideal, as the small house they used to live in was torn down to make room for a chicken coop. In spite of her mother's traumatic exile, Matun and Alicia were able to thrive thanks to our government and the grace of God, further demonstrating how perspective shapes an individual's memory. As a result, the government may have done right from the perspective of Matun, while Lizette's mother was exiled and left heartbroken. Even so, Menéndez highlights the importance of ethnic heritage over political turmoil, as everyone recognizes Lizette's face despite having never met them. Menéndez includes this to signify that Lizette's work trip was not just a trip to a foreign country, but a return that enabled the meaningful interpretation of her own culture. Many of the concepts described within Joane Nagel's Constructing Ethnicity are reflected through Menéndez's work, especially in relation to ethnic boundaries and the external forces that shape said boundaries. Lizette was born into an American society, and while Miami has a large Latino population, Miami was no substitute for the green hills of Cuba, nor could they replace her mother's white columns and rose garden. While Lizette can potentially experience discrimination within the United States because of her ethnicity, Lizette had been vaguely hurt that no one recognized her as Cuban, and even began to overpronounce her Spanish to prevent these assumptions. Nagel describes this complex relationship that Lisette has with her own ethnicity as a composite of the view one has of oneself as well as the views held by others about one's ethnic identity, where in one society Lisette's ethnicity is distinguishable, but in another she must exaggerate these traits to fit in. Nagel further explores the political construction of ethnicity through economic turmoil and immigration policies. Nagel reveals that immigration is a major engine of new ethnic group production, as labor shortages and colonial-era failures have encouraged a growth in ethnic diversity across the world. Similarly, Lisette's parents fled Cuba for safer surroundings and inadvertently introduced a uniquely new generation to America. Menéndez's experiences, as shown through her mother's house, display the reality within Nagel's research, revealing the influence that immigration and return migrations have on one's ethnic identity and self-actualization.